All right, everybody, good afternoon. Nice to not quite see you all again. And thank you for joining us for the third week of our Home Games webinars. For any of you that are in for the first time, usual sort of bit, these are going to last half an hour. Now, last week, a few of you were nice enough to write to me and obviously tell me that the joke sucked, but also were nice enough to write to say that you'd rather do 45 minutes than 30. But some other folk have been in touch and said that they really liked it. It was just 30 minutes and done. So we're going to do 30 minutes, right? You'll be out at 12:30. 1 o'clock, sorry. We're starting at 12:30. But for the first time, we're going to do an after party. So we're going to keep the chat open. It's like the worst after party ever. You can see Mike really itching to take the piss, but we're gonna keep it open for 50 minutes after, and we'll stay chatting and all that kind of stuff. But the main content will all wrap up by 1 o'clock. Somebody's saying excellent shirt, Mike. Mike's celebrating cricket this week rather than, for example, doing any work. But that's it's just the way it's going to go. The idea of the home game sessions is that we're not going to spend our time talking about viruses and unpleasantness and all that kind of stuff. We want to run sessions that cover things we might talk about if all this nonsense wasn't actually happening, and just a chance to be a bit silly and whatever, and have a nice half an hour on a Wednesday lunchtime. The t-shirt of the week this week, obviously you all know, is pretty well known stuff, the Swiss black metal avant-garde pioneers Celtic Frost. And I know it's a bit old hat, but those of you that are not familiar with the Frosties, maybe don't start with the album this depicts called Morbid Tales. Maybe go a little bit later to something like To Megatherion and then work back. Stay away from Cold Lake, though. That's just for completists. Right, I'll tell you what we're going to do. I'm going to share my screen and we will get a little bit of content stuff going on. Here we go. And I will make me and Mike much smaller, which I think we can all agree is for the best. And let's have a look at what we're going to cover today. So we will do just another little bit from some of the survey and insight stuff that we did at the tail end of last year. And that's going to be about investment propositions, centralized investment versus centralized retirement propositions. And I agree, Smithy, we should definitely ban John's jokes. The last one, not only couldn't we tell it live, we couldn't even leave it on the chat. But what can I tell you, is a bad man. So we'll do a little bit of that. Then we'll get into the FCA's business plan, and that's the sort of meat of our session this week. And Mike's going to take us through that stuff. He's our resident regulation whisperer, and we'll do the necessaries then. There's going to be a joke. There's always going to be a joke, and you're going to hate it, and I don't care. Actually, last week's kind of split people down the middle, which is my very, very favourite kind of joke. And then we'll see if any of you want to hang around for the after party. I'd be amazed if you do, frankly, but we'll give it a bash anyway and see what happens. Right, here we go. So for those of you, again, that maybe haven't dialed in before, we're sharing little bits of the kind of big research exercise we did with about 400 firms in November, December. Just a nice way to kick us off. And we asked those firms what sort of centralized investment proposition, if any, that they ran. Now, 82% of the respondents said that they do run a centralized investment proposition. So that kind of seems about right. Actually, when we looked at the verbatims of the 18%, it's all anonymous, so we didn't know who'd said what, unless they signed their name, which one or two did, which is cool. But even the ones that said they didn't run a centralized investment proposition actually kind of were, because they are trying to micro-segment So they still had a common approach to investment, but they were working generally with a very, very few large client families, perhaps, almost acting as a multifamily office, which is a subject to which I think we'll return in later home games, unless we all get let out at the end of, or the start of next week, isn't it? We find out if we leave lockdown, but I'm pretty happy to lay a good portion of Mike's burgeoning salary that's absolutely not going to be the case. So 82% of firms running a CIP, and we put them into kind of buckets about what kind of CIP they run. And so about 2/3 of firms run their own proposition, one sort or another, and that might be on a discretionary basis or an advisory basis. Now, that's if you're looking across the yellow bars at the moment, and you can read them, I know it's a wee bit small on screens, but it's the nature of graphs, right? You may notice that the yellow bars, which is the percentage of firms who use it, I think you're right, Gary, adds up to considerably more than 100%. So it adds up to about 250%, actually. And that's because lots and lots of firms told us they have more than one CIP that they use, depending on the client group, which all sounds very proddy and very segmenty, and probably quite a good thing. So about 2/3 of firms are running their own proposition. About half will outsource at least some stuff to a DFM. 75% of firms will use a multi-asset fund at some point as part of a CIP somewhere. Generally speaking, it's exactly where you think it would be, which is at the kind of smaller portfolio end, which I still think is kind of weird, especially in general investment accounts with your with CGT issues and all the rest of it. And I don't know, we might, if you're into it, we might talk about that another time as well. And over half of our respondents, which is mainly independent firms, right, DA firms rather than network members, we're using packaged ranges. So these are investment solutions where you can't divorce the investment range from the product. So I guess classic ones would be Royal London government portfolios or Proof Fund or those kind of things. So they're kind of absolutely stitched together. So lots and lots of usage of all these kinds of propositions, as you would expect. But maybe more interesting than that is the green line on the graph, if you can read it. Now, what this shows you is the percentage of flow of new business that goes into this kind of investment solution where a firm uses it. Okay, so for those who run their own propositions, they tend to flow 63% of their assets into that proposition. Those who use multi-asset funds, for example, 2 bars along, about 40% flows into that. Those that outsource to DFM, about 35%, just over 34%, flows into that kind of solution. And then for packaged ranges, a little bit less, down at 20%. The red line underneath that shows flow over everybody, whether or not they use that kind of proposition, but we won't worry about that for now. And I guess the kind of observation, hang on, sorry, Rich, any indicator how many firms were in more than one bucket? Lots and lots of them. I'll check that out, actually. I can't remember off the top of my head. I don't know if Steve's on. He might know off the top of his head, but it's a high proportion. A high proportion ticked more than one box here, which is kind of interesting. And again, in future weeks, stacking stuff up here, we might even look at some of the reasons that firms said that they would use one thing and why they wouldn't use other things, because there's some interesting stuff in there. But the thing that kind of struck me from this, right, is how much higher the flow is where firms are running their own proposition than for anything else. So if you do run advisory models or your own discretionary models or whatever else, and I imagine lots of you on the call probably do, wow, it's not just a bit higher. It's not just a kind of easy, that's a wee bit more here. There is, not far off double. What flows to a DFM. So even if you've got a centralized investment proposition that is based on, for example, a DFM model, you're using that about half the amount of time that you do for the individual ones. And I think there's some interesting stuff to think about in there about kind of pride, an emotional connection. There used to be a sort of, I think, I don't know, go back, what, 10, 15 years? Which platform you were signed up with became like a badge, right? It was like an emotional connection, and that feels like that's gone away now. But I think it is there with this investment bit, and I think what you're seeing is a kind of really statistically significant concentration of clients into a particular form of investment where the firm has its name on the tin, and that's interesting. So, do we believe, for example, Andrew, I'll come to your question in just a wee sec. Do we believe, for example, that inherently an advisory model with the advisor's brand on it is more suitable for more clients than a DFM model? Because if we do believe that, then these numbers make sense. If we don't believe it, then something else is going on. And that's kind of interesting. And when we get into the business plan for the regulator and the assessing suitability reviews and so on, I think we're going to see that we're going to need to be really, really careful as a sector about the suitability lines that we draw. Now, that's nothing to do with financial planning, right? Let's be very clear. Financial planning is kind of over here. The art of working out a client's future needs and goals and aspirations and making sure they meet them and all that. This is at the kind of kit supply end of the thing, and about saying, why should it be, all other things being equal, that it's much, much more suitable for a client to go into an advisor's own proposition than into a packaged range or a multi-asset fund or a DFM model portfolio, and how are we making those cases? I think that's kind of interesting. So I've got a couple of chatty bits coming in. Let's have a look. Andrew says, do you have any split between advisory discretionary for those firms running own? Yes, I do, Andrew. So only about 8 to 10% of firms are running their own discretionary models. And that's about right. The last stat I saw, which the guys, Ray from CashCalc very kindly helped us uncover a while ago, was that something like 7% of directly authorized firms also hold discretionary permissions. That's a little bit out of date now, but it was good enough for government work at the time. So that feels about right. Matthew's got some words, say running your own proposition, seeking to justify fees, and he's put, I'm counting 3 exclamation marks. And we all know that you can't mess with 3 exclamation marks. I don't know, Matthew, maybe some people will have some stuff to say about that. And Phil, this is a really great point, right? Is this not driven from margin gain from the in-house models? And that's really interesting. I see no evidence at all in our survey work, whether in this particular survey or in all the things that we do throughout the year, or just from being out and about and meeting firms. I don't see any evidence that firms that are running their own models are charging significantly more than firms who aren't. It seems pretty flat in terms of ongoing advisor charge. Mike, I don't know if you've seen any differences between the two.
No, completely agree. It's either 0.75, 1% or 0.5, depending on who you are, really.
Yeah, we might do an advisor charging bit one week as well. We're going to need to be locked down for like months for all this to happen. It's really remarkable. Firms do charge in kind of 25 basis point chunks. So people either charge 1.75 or 0.5. Very, very few people tick, 0.8 or 0.85 or anything like that. So I don't know if it is margin gain. And you could argue that it's actually a margin loss, because you're going to have to spend much, much more time on investment, and time being money and all the rest of it, than if you outsource. But they can charge again for investment management. Again, not many do, Tim. This is the thing. There are some big firms, consolidators and so on, that have proprietary investment solutions. And yes, of course, there's manufacturing margin coming in through those. But in this stuff, in basic advisory models, no, not really. It's got loads of comments here. Are you suggesting that the service is included in advisor charging? Mark from John. John, what I'm saying here is that in advisory models, you don't tend to see the equivalent of a DFM charge. So where, and John, we've mentioned him several times now, John runs a DFM that doesn't charge in this way, but might be 20 or 25 basis points plus VAT. That isn't there in that advisor charging model. It just all wraps inside the ongoing advisor charge. So that's kind of interesting. On cost, Ian's asking, are there more passive in-house models? We're seeing quite a move towards passive, but there's still loads and loads and loads of active management there. And one of the things that we talk about sometimes when we're feeding back survey stuff to big groups is that there's a big difference between the noise you hear out there in the trades or in social media and so on and established practice. And so it's become orthodox, I think, to decry active management and that sort of thing in the pages of money marketing or on Twitter or whatever else. But actually, there's tons of active models out there. There is also quite a lot of barbell strategy going on, just a bit of passive in there to try and damp the cost a little bit. Running an investment proposition is not nil cost, says Lee, and I couldn't agree more, Lee. I think that's absolutely right. I'm trying to keep up with these chat things here. There's quite a lot down the right, sorry. Now, what's really interesting, right? Even this discussion that we're having is whenever we talk to a firm about their investment proposition, centralized investment proposition, what we talk about always is exactly what we're doing here. Hi, Katie. We go straight to the kit, right? We don't necessarily talk about the process that took us to deciding that that kit was the most suitable. And I think that's kind of interesting because the P is proposition, right? But the proposition isn't just the portfolios or the funds or whatever it may be. The proposition is the approach. That's why you get commonality of outcome for people with roughly similar needs. It's the thought process and the approach that takes you through. Now, in the CIP world, where we're talking about accumulation business, that seems to not be at the forefront of people's minds, especially when they're answering stuff like this. But on my next slide, and my last slide before I hand over to Mike, we asked the same stuff roughly about CRPs, but we asked an extra question as well, and I want to touch on that here. And what we asked was whether firms are recommending different investments for clients in drawdown, because we don't use the other D word because it's not a word, than they do in accumulation. And here's what they said, and the answers are quite long, so I'll précis them for you. Only about 10% of firms said that they run different models, different investment approach for clients who are in retirement. About 20% reckoned that they were maybe thinking about it, but they weren't quite sure which way to go. Another 20% said, hell no, having no part of it. We don't run any kind of centralized proposition for retirement because it's much too complex and too individualized, and I can respect that. But here's the biggest single answer was 45% of the firms we spoke to said, we do have a centralized retirement proposition, but it's not about the investments. It's about the process supporting the investments and how we get to what's most suitable. And cash flow modeling, obviously, a huge part of this for clients in drawdown and all that kind of stuff. And I just thought that was a kind of interesting thing to bring out for our little session here to kick us off, was that a CIP was always meant to be about the logic flow that said my client's needs are this and suitability is that, defined as that, therefore these particular kinds of investment approaches work. But we jump, I'm trying getting distracted with comments coming up, but we jump straight to the kit. For the CRP, what we do is we jump straight to process because we're not thinking about the kit so much, because we're using, as a sector, you're using roughly the same stuff. So it doesn't make sense perhaps to think about the kit so much. It's about the demonstration of suitability, which actually, to me, synthesizing stuff out of all these answers and loads of other bits that I don't have time to show you today, actually looks better. I wonder if it could be the case that a focus on the process of why this investment approach will work actually might do better in terms of the demonstration of suitability that we've talked about with PROD and MIFID and stuff on previous weeks, might do better than it does for accumulation. And that would be kind of interesting. Maybe we do need a session on it. How many said aye, we do, Nathan, with an eye like that? About 10% said that, so it's of 400 firms roughly. I guess you can, I'm pretty sure, Nathan, you can do the maths. How is longevity taken into account, says Mark, in CRPs? Great question, and lots and lots of different approaches. Maybe we'll come back, maybe we'll do a CRP session another week, and if somebody is feeling really strongly about it and wants to come on, then let me know, right, and we'll get you on. So that'll do for that for the moment, just kind of stuff to think about. And now let's have a look at the FCA business plan with DJ Michael Barrett.
Good afternoon. Flip the slide, please, Maestro. So business plan came out yesterday. It's an annual event. Last year's had, I think, 56 pages. This year's 26. So they've obviously got far more important things to be talking about, and it's quite a stripped backed version. Also worth noting that the business plan itself talks about how there's quite likely to be a whole heap of changes made to it over the coming months as things work out. I think pretty much everything the FCA does at the moment has been touched and changed by the events of the last month. I've just put a link into the chat room, which is their central repository for everything that is changing, so all aspects of regulation. So I think it's worth keeping an eye on that, and particularly the areas which you're interested, kind of searching for that and looking through. So before we get into kind of the kind of a couple of real bits we've pulled out on the business plan, there's quite a few other bits which were touched elsewhere within the document. So there's some changes around asset management market study, or some potential additional work around that. So I think some of the stuff around value for money statements, there's been some very mixed approaches to that. Some of them have done very, very well. Others are writing 85-page reports and not mentioning the Woodford word once, even though their funds invested into that. Looking at you, Hargreaves, for that one. So yeah, looking at maybe at kind of different approaches to that, and how that work which is going into the governance side of things for asset managers could potentially get rolled out into the consumer world. So what needs to happen to disclosure to reflect some of that. There's some changes which have been announced elsewhere, also a delay to the assessing suitability 2 work, which we'll come back to in a moment. Lots of delays elsewhere. So some of the stuff around platforms has the work around improving the transfer process. So all of those lovely super clean share classes that save your clients, sometimes if they're lucky, about 4 or 5 basis points, and all of the horrible complexity that goes around that, making it supposedly much easier to transfer. The rules have been defined for that, but they don't now need to be implemented until February next year. Albeit I think a lot of platforms are probably already well into that space as well. The exit fee stuff on the platform market study is still due in summer 2020, whatever the hell that's going to look like. Probably the most interesting delay, I think, that's come out of it is the stuff around investment pathways. So I can remember talking to one of the brightest people I know at a provider at the start of the year, who was telling me just what a big piece of work investment pathways was and how significant it was going to be. That's being pushed back to February 21, and in terms of the implementation, and as it stands, the rules from that are unchanged. But I just wonder whether people might look at the experience of the last month or so and think, do the investment pathways, which is obviously all about getting people into drawdown, does that need to evolve? How good would the experience have been if your pathway had put you into a single fund, for example, for the last months or so? So yeah, I think that, as I said, that feels like that's always going to be a big piece of work anyway, and certainly one to keep an eye on. The only other thing to talk about is all the ongoing joy around DB and DC stuff is still carrying on in terms of the supervisory work. The deadline for some of the qualifications has been put back a full year to reflect the fact that you can't actually take exams at the moment. But yeah, big moving target, so keep an eye on it. But within the business plan, I think most people on this are probably in our world of advisors, platforms, asset managers. As I said, it's only 26 pages, so there's no sport on the telly at the moment, so maybe spend some time to read it. But if you really don't want to get into it, I would still urge you just to look at page 14. So I pulled out 3 kind of areas around this. So investment products are appropriate for consumer needs. So people are getting into stuff which is far riskier and risky in terms of volatility, risky in terms of illiquidity, lack of regulatory protection. Yeah, all of the sort of products which we know and love. So kind of some of the CFD stuff, Bitcoin, mini bonds, and all the rest of it. And it's not necessarily the product itself. It could well be that the wrapper looks to be fine and is fine. So for LCF, I know we saw ISAs, about a lot of that was contained within an ISA wrapper. Nothing wrong with an ISA, obviously, but the underlying product was horrific. So really highlighting some of that. The products have problems. Consumers are unable to make effective decisions around all of that, and also access, in some cases, advice. So they're unaware of how they can protect themselves from all of that stuff. Next slide, please. And then finally, actually looking at it from the internal firm's point of view. So that environment that is out there where there are some really, really horrible products which most people shouldn't be going near, and they're getting marketed directly to the mass market. And the kind of the lack of understanding that exists on the consumer side. There are some firms who are exploiting that, and everybody kind of knows that the industry has got a lot more professional over the last years, and is generally in a lot of cases is acting in consumers' best interests. But there are firms who are not. So if we could jump to the final slide around this, one of the big themes I think of which I think the industry needs to talk about is taking this quote from the business plan. An area where we have seen increasing consumer harm is retail investments. And obviously that's quite a broad statement, retail investments, and covers a lot of things. But as I said, there are good guys within this industry, and actually the argument that it's not an industry, it's a profession is a pretty compelling argument, and has a lot of truth embedded into it. I just think one of the characteristics I would expect of a profession is that it's quite introspective and is comfortable challenging itself to make sure that it is continuously improving and continuously doing the best for its clients. And I just wonder whether there's certainly some work where the good guys need to step up and highlight the work that the bad guys are doing and how that should be avoided. And actually the FCA are doing exactly that. So within the business plan, they're talking about creating a campaign to highlight the danger that these illiquid assets and unregulated stuff, etc., can represent. And that needs to be funded. It's quite alarming just how good some of the scammers are in terms of their own marketing and exploiting social media and Google and all of that stuff. So if you're going to compete against them, you need to deliver an equally effective marketing campaign. And the FCA are going to do that, or at least attempt to, and they've proposed explicitly that that's going to be funded through the fees that regulated firms are paying. An additional 0.4% on top of the fees which firms are paying is the proposal. And yeah, at least they're being transparent about it, I guess, in terms of what it's attempting to achieve and how it's going to be funded. But I think to take it back to the assessing suitability stuff, I think there's a lot of questions which are going to come out of some of that. I've seen the questionnaire which the FCA was sending out to advice firms in the last kind of couple of months, and it's all about the types of stuff which Mark talked about. So what type of proposition are you going into? Why are you going into that in-house one? For an at-retirement stuff, why does the customer need to go into something that potentially requires them to pay ongoing fees for the next 20 or 30 years? And yes, there's service elements, and in a lot of cases you can answer those questions, but I just think there's maybe a few questions which the industry would serve itself well to answer and consider. So things like the fact that total cost of ownership has generally gone up since RDR. We routinely see things which are above 2% ongoing total charge as well. And yeah, lots and lots of kind of illiquid stuff, which is still out there, which people tend to gravitate towards. So this is as I said, I think this will be the big theme for the coming years. So I'd urge you all to give it a read.
Thanks, Mike. And the thing that gets me about this, right, is first of all, you're going to fund your own your regulator's campaign about the dangers of retail investments, and how, I don't know what percentage of the public out there, as opposed to people who are kind of interested in investments, will be able to distinguish between stuff that we know is bad. So London Capital Finance or Aldermore or all those kind of things, to distinguish that from the kind of investment solutions that most IFAs recommend, which are completely fine. They'll just hear investments are risky or dodgy. And we might be in a remarkable situation where firms have funded an FCA campaign that effectively does the opposite of telling people to seek advice. So it's going to need a lot of careful treading. Listen, we're nearly out of time, so I'll just quickly pop to this last slide. And it's time for the joke. And the barman from last week, who, as I think you know, had to deal with a giraffe, this week has to a deal with something quite different. And a chap walks into this bar with 3 ducks, a duck in front of him, a duck to the left of him, and a duck to the right of him, and says, "I'll have a pint, please, and I'll have a pint for each of my friends, the ducks." And the barman is got used to it by this time. He's used to sentient animals coming into his bar and drinking alcohol. He's basically fine with it. So he thinks, well, I'll just make the best of this. So as he's pouring the pint for the duck in front of the guy, he says, so pal, what's your name? He's Glaswegian. And the duck says, my name's Huey. And he says, oh, hi, Huey, how you doing? Had a nice day? Oh, he says, oh, it's been brilliant. You might have seen it's a filthy day out there. We've been in and out of puddles all day, splashing around, having a magnificent time. It's been awesome. Oh, that's nice, Huey. I'm glad to hear it. Glad to hear it. There's your pint. And he says to the duck on the guy's left, what's your name, pal? And the guy says, oh, my name's Louis. How you doing, Louis? I am grand. And what have you been up to? You boys been out together? Aye, that's right. Yeah. We've been out. Me and Huey, we've been out splashing around. We've been in and out of puddles all day. It's a filthy day, but it's great for us. We've had a fantastic time. Oh, there you go. There's your pint, pal. And as he's about to start pouring the pint for the duck on the guy's right, the duck looks up and says, and before he asks, my name's Puddles. I don't ask what kind of day I've had. There you go. I like that joke. That's the end for us. We will stay on. If you are looking to do something to help and you're not doing some of the practical things that many people are doing with the NHS, I'll say it every week. The Samaritans are seeing an outrageous spike in people using their services, and if you think about what that involves, then that's not a great thing. So if you are looking to support anybody and you've got a few quid spare, you can do a lot worse than the Samaritans, and the details are there. Thank you all for being here. We'll be back at 12:30, and that's us. That's our show. So thanks for being here. Thanks for Mike as well. And I'll just now keep watching the right and see what's going on here. So I'll stay quiet for a moment and then perk up again. Cheers. All right. So what have we got still on? Oh man, there's loads of people still on. That's crazy. There's about 90% of people are still on. I don't know what to talk about. So I'm going to watch the chat bit, and if you've got some stuff. The joke was much better this week, says Nick. Thank you. Although I noticed that Peter preferred the giraffe joke. And he also mentions, Pete, I don't know if you're still here, ministers have a focus on vulnerable customers at the moment and are concerned of rising access costs. And that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Rising access costs. What's the minimum AUA that most advisors now want before they'll deal with a fresh client? Mike, what do you reckon?
I think there tends to be this. It's not something which most advisors have thought about, and there's a few firms we're working with at the moment where the process of going through fraud allows you to understand the services you're delivering to your client, and you can start to get a handle on the cost of delivering those services. And magically, you then start to have a charging structure which you make sure that every single client is actually profitable. And that doesn't feel to me to be something which a lot of firms have in place. So magically, it tends to be kind of, you've got to have at least, and plucking a figure out of the air, 50 to 100,000 to invest. But as I said, that doesn't actually necessarily reflect what the cost of delivering those services are.
Yeah, if you think about back to the survey and stuff again, we're starting to see people gate with minimum fees, you know. So you might only have 50 grand or whatever else, but starting to see this idea of minimums. And so that rising cost of advice, that's probably right? And if we want to avoid the scammers and stuff, then I don't know what we do about that. So what else have we got? Yeah, a lot of people are having a pop. So here's Matthew. I'm not sure which. I don't know if it's Matthew Walton or which Matthew it is, but has no AUA, and they've got clients who use Vanguard Direct, and we charge planning fees. And that's interesting because we had Tim on very briefly last week. I might get him back again because he seemed so popular. And he was using Vanguard, albeit for somebody that he was connected with, but he's got other clients that are on Vanguard. So here's a question for the group down the side. Anybody using Vanguard Direct with clients for a lot less in terms of custody charges than you can pay elsewhere, but no advisor fee facilitation?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing on that as well is if you think about the price cap that Vanguard Direct has, which doesn't exist on any advised platforms. So I'm not sure many advised clients with, say, $1 million to invest end up 100% in Vanguard Life Strategy. But if that's the case, then they're going to save several thousand a year by moving it to Vanguard Direct for custody fees.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, you know, we're into pricing and all that kind of stuff, but there's so few platforms have a price cap. You know, I know more IFAs that cap their fees at a certain kind of decency level than platforms that do that. And there's a tiering down thing, but that doesn't have that big of an effect, to be really honest. I mean, it depends, but a bit here and a bit there, but not masses. So there's Vanguard. There's, other than the fixed fee guys in the direct market, there's not that many either. And I can only think of one in the advised market, which is ARC. Yeah. It's got a cap on it. Not sure if anybody, special deals you might have, I guess. Rich Allen, oh, here we go. Just before we get to Rich's one, Nathan, we've still got 65 people on. Don't you all have lunches to eat? Nathan says, I think to be profitable, a client needs to have at least £250,000 quid. So that's at 0.75, that's £1,875 a year. And you sort of hear that £2,000 figure a bit, Mike. You heard that out and about, kind of that's what it takes to run a client. It's probably a couple of grand a year.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, as I said, I think you need to go through the hard miles of doing the science beneath it to work out what that cost of delivering your services are, and then it's perfectly reasonable that you make some margin on top of that and charge accordingly. But you end up in that. Yeah, as I think as Lee said, to run an advice business there's a lot of cost that's inherent within that, so that should be covered somehow. Yeah,
and you know, this comes back to the cost chain and how it ramps up and the stuff that you were talking about, Mike, about, you know, ending up at over 2%. And if you've ever seen either of us do any talks over the last little while, 2% is nothing. We're seeing stuff well above 3%. And it sneaks up on you. That's the thing. You sort of don't realize it's getting up that high. So yeah, caps and stuff, and some element of fixed fees. There's John again from Sparrows saying it's not a plug, although it clearly is a plug, John. I noticed that. But we forgive you because you stayed on for the whole time, so you're allowed. We should do like a sponsored plug thing. You know, our plugs today will be sponsored by whatever. Try and raise some money. I guess you see it a bit there, but things like the IMPS portfolio stuff from Intelliflo as well. That's kind of trying to drive at some of that, is trying to get these percentage charges kind of sat on a little bit. And Schleider, I completely agree, mate. I completely agree. Hey, here's a good one from Rich Allam. Always got good stuff to ask. Have you got a watch list of platforms with percentage charges seeing big impacts of income falls due to markets? Now, we were discussing this kind of thing just the other day, Mike, about new business stats and what those might show in the next little while.
I think the watch list is pretty much every single platform at the moment. So the nature of AUA revenue, which most platforms rely on, as we just talked about, and also I suspect that Q2 is not going to be the greatest quarter they've ever had for new business flows, not least because advisors have got a lot of better things to be doing, I think, than writing new business at the moment. So reassuring clients, working with their business and their staff to reassure them as well. That's, yeah, as I said, I think Q2 in terms of flows is not going to be great for platforms. And their revenue, obviously, the power of pure mathematics when you're charging a percentage basis is significant. We had a session, Mark, you'll know this, a couple of weeks ago from a very, very large global asset manager who was saying that their funds under management at the end of December was something like 600 billion, and it touched on 400 billion in a couple of weeks ago. So huge falls. Yeah, most platforms haven't lost 200 billion in the last few weeks, but everybody's gone in the same direction.
Absolute scenes. Absolute scenes. So it must do. The question is, how long is the trough, right? We might find out some things about, if this goes on, we might find out some things about the kind of covenant. And this, it's why these chats are great, because you spin off into all sorts of different areas. But one of the things that we've always kind of struggled to systemize is assessing financial strength of platforms. And of course, there's profitability and all that kind of stuff. But I imagine, wiping out a quarter of the revenue or whatever it might be, that's good. That probably knocked most businesses down from being profitable to unprofitable. And we might learn some things about not so much the kind of profitability side of stuff, which people use as a proxy for financial strength, but kind of isn't, but about the covenant of the people who provide funding to those businesses.
Yeah.
Go on, Mike.
Good point from Stan in the chat around 2008 flows increased. I think definitely I can remember myself being part of an investment team at the time and kind of going out with this is the buying opportunity of a generation line, and yeah, we had the flows were good off the back of that. I just think the thing that's slightly different this time, Stan, is that, as I said, advisors I speak with are distracted, for want of a better word, by having to spend much more time remodeling their business. So moving to working from home, working out how they can work remotely, working out how they have to work with providers. And then also most of the conversations they're having with clients are kind of reassurance. I spoke with an advisor last week who said all he's doing is speaking to a lot of his clients who are reasonably elderly, and actually a lot of them have been in forced self-isolation for several weeks, and the benefit for them is just to have a conversation with somebody. So yeah, I hope you're right on that, and the flows are right, but I just think advisors, as I said, they've had better things to be doing, or more important things to be doing over time. So
there's a couple of bits kind of coming in. Who's it was saying? Anthony O'Connor saying, looking at the future back office, it's also a platform, and John Farmer from Premium saying the same sort of thing. And that sort of feels right. These are actually questions about compression of supply chain, right? That's what that's about, is integration. And it feels like we mentioned it already, or I mentioned it with the IMPS thing from Intelliflo, and IO probably feels the most kind of integrative, but then Iris have got lots of parts of their empire as well. And we surely can't be that far away from linking those two. So you've got at the moment you've got two sources of client data, which we all know is problematic more often than it ideally would be. and to try and get through that to one kind of golden source with a custody and trading solution sitting underneath it. It can't be that far away, do you think, Mike?
You'd like to think so. I think my mind goes back to the work we did last summer, and I've done a few similar gigs since then, where when you actually spend time with advice firms and you go sit down and see the process which they go through, the amount of paper that they have to go through and push around and rekeying and all the rest of it, it's astonishing. It reminds me of kind of the start of this century, where I was going out and first speaking to advisor firms. Not a lot has changed in a lot of cases around all of that. But I do think the thing that is changing is the technology side of it, the barriers to entry, the potential solutions feel like they're becoming a lot more of a reality. But there's still, as I said, the process that most advisor firms have to go through to do relatively simple cases, and the key person risk that tends to be stored up within a superstar in every single firm, where there's always somebody who knows how they get shit done. And that's still a very, very big barrier, I think, even if the technology side sorts itself out.
Yeah, and Tim points out, he's right, Enable Infusion, probably it's still feels like a platform and a back office. I'm a big fan of Enable Infusion, actually. I think it's really good stuff. And the way I think about it is that the platform kind of just stays quiet underneath, and you actually run everything from the back office. Stan says, quite rightly, Stan, you're absolutely bang on, mate. The old asset versus data aggregation debate, 20 plus years with no answer. And that's just what you're saying, Mike, early part of the century, when you were but 12 years old. Yeah. Remarkable stuff. And John's absolutely right on industry messaging and stuff. Let's cover one more thing, right? And then let's call it, because I need to go and remind the kids that they've got a father. I don't know where he lives, but little father joke there. And Rich was talking about Secular Alpha, Fundment, all these kind of guys. I think so, but I think it's going to have to get driven from the back office. I really do. So some kind of deep link between those kind of guys. And there are really two absolutely dominant back office firms, and another one or two that are kind of coming onto a game with Time for Advice and Enable as well. All right, so let's just have a wee think about Rich's last question. Do you think consolidators are licking their lips at the moment with advice firms possibly struggling? One thing I did see, did you see the piece? I can't remember who wrote it. It might have been Katie was on earlier. I'm not sure. Maybe it was her. Wrote a thing about AFH, talking about writing out to all the advisors in AFH. I don't know if they're self-employed or not. If they're anyway, no, doesn't matter. Saying, hey, look, if you've got no new business coming in, this is a great time to get that old legacy business across to your new cost-free AFH platform and into your AFH investment solutions and all that kind of stuff, which kind of makes sense, right? People are going to fill their time somehow. So I don't know, Mike, we'll leave this one to you. Consolidators licking their lips because there might be firms struggling and be able to be picked up quite easily, or finding things a little bit difficult and having to try and find stuff to do to keep the lights on.
Yeah, I just think generally one of the things which I've been starting to try and get my head around for the consolidator market is that it feels to me like there's only ever going to be a finite pool of decent firms to acquire. So kind of you put aside all of the advice firms, you've got no interest in whatsoever of going down the consolidator route. They want to remain independent and do their own thing, which is cool. You kind of take out the firms who are who've already gone down that path. And yeah, as I said, there's kind of a segment of advice of the advisors where potentially they could be they're up for being consolidated and could be attracted to consolidators. And I just think there's going to be a shallow end and a deep end of that pool, or whatever the analogy I want to come up with is, where eventually you're going to run out of quality firms to acquire within that space. And if you are a consolidator, you're going to have to maybe go and kiss a few ugly brides, or
what?
stretching that beyond
Diversity training immediately for Mr. Michael Barrett.
Yeah.
Goodness me.
But yeah, I don't think if a firm wasn't particularly attractive 6 weeks ago, I can't imagine they're getting. I can't imagine any firm is more attractive in it than it was 6 weeks ago. So yeah.
Well, there we go. Listen, it's 20 past. We've done an extra 20 minutes of total nonsense. Thank you all for staying on. There's still over 50 people hanging on. Thank you very much. Let's call it here. Drop us a note or something. You all know where we are. Of what you might like us to cover next week. My plan was to go back to last week's subject, and we talked about digital business and stuff there, and have a look at that from a paraplanner's point of view. We had an advisor on last week, and we're hoping that Kathy Harrison's going to join us next week. So that'll probably be next week sorted, and I've got some ideas for the couple of weeks after that. But so happy to take more ideas if you've got them. We'll usually try and cover 2 subjects, I think, on each week. See you later. Thanks very much.